This morning I want to think with you about the idea of communion and community and communitas and this idea of the next 90. But Linda and I were actually thinking about this story together just a few days ago, because Tim Brewster is sick, and so at the last minute he invited Linda to preach in his stead. And Linda looked at me and said, because this was my birthday yesterday, and so on Friday, late afternoon, early evening, she gets the notice, and she says, well, if I do this, there goes your birthday. And so I said, well, then just tell him no. So anyway, if you went over there in the main sanctuary at 9:30, you realize she ignored me. And but we did sort of have some interesting ideas. And as we thought about this story, as the Hungry Mungry is just like the perfect sort of image, the metaphor for consumerism, right? I mean, it's just who we are in this country. And it was funny, as I was reading that story, we were reading it to our 7-year-old granddaughter, Molly, the other night. And when we read the part about Hungry Mungry swallowing his parents, it was really funny because her jaw just kind of dropped. He swallowed his parents? And then when we read the part about eating his home, she said, but where is he going to live now? And then when we read the part about him gulping down the whole world, she was horrified, and she said, he won't have anyone to take care of him or play with him. And when we read the very end that he had swallowed himself, she just looked up at Linda, rolled her eyes, and said, well, that's just stupid. Didn't anybody ever teach him about consequences? I mean, Hungry Mungry is like the all-time consumer. And that's essentially what we are. We're consumers. At least to marketers and many businesses, we're consumers. To many churches, we're consumers. Even our economy, our very economy, depends on this idea that we consume things. We understand that, and yet we also find that it's hard sometimes to not see ourselves as consumers. Everything seems to be so centered upon our consumption, our pleasure, our interest in something. And so we find out that if, for example, even worship services, if they don't interest anymore, if they don't speak to us anymore, well, we just go somewhere else. Or if we're upset about something, well, rather than trying to figure out a way to participate in it, to sort of engage in it with the other folks or with the pastor or with the leadership, instead, we just kind of pick up and move. We're consumers. And as church leaders, we go to conferences where they teach us how to make sure that what you're going to do is interesting, and make sure your messages are structured like this, and make sure your band is like this, and make sure that the staging... I mean, there's so much that goes into worship preparation now that's consumer-oriented. So it's hard to get out of this understanding. Harvey Cox, who's a professor at Harvard Divinity School and wrote hundreds of books, but one of his more recent books was called The Market as God. And it's a fairly technical book, but it's got a lot of interesting thoughts in it. But one of the things that he says is that all of our orientation towards politics has been oriented around consumerism. It's essentially oriented around capitalism is essentially oriented around the consumer model. But so has religion become that way. In the West, religion has gotten oriented around this idea of catching the interest of someone, of the congregant or the worshiper. And Jesus saw the consequence of that, because even in his day, that was still prominent. And once you find people in power, they start structuring just how it is that others are going to worship, and others are going to be included. And so what he would remind his followers is that life is more than simply what we participate in. It's more than simply what we consume, and it's more than what we offer in purchase for. Because a lot of the Old Testament religious life was oriented around us purchasing salvation, in a sense. Us offering sacrifice for God's love, in a sense. And Jesus was saying, that's not what religious life is like at all. And so if you followed his example, what you found yourself being engaged with the most unlikely of people. Because what he was trying to say was that we, as the light of the world, which we'll get into in a series coming up, the I am sayings, but when he said we are the light of the world, he was saying we are connected. We are radiant with one another. We are radiant to others. We participate with one another in community. And so even the early church was oriented around this idea of community, and we were no longer dependent on God to bestow grace. We became co-workers with God's grace. We became co-creators, if you want to think in terms of 20th century, 21st century sort of nomenclature, terminology. We became co-creatives with God. We have this chance to actually participate in the life we live. And the phrase that I've often used in here is that we have a chance to bring life to life. This is our calling. Harold Kushner once wrote that most people are not afraid of dying, they're afraid of not having lived. Because we have a profound dread, he wrote, not of death, but of insignificance. The notion that we will be born and that we will live and that one day we will die, or maybe not have counted for anything. So unlike the messages we often get in our society that we are nothing but consumers, Kushner says, a meaningful life is one that actually gives into the future, that plants life, that brings life to life. Now that's an interesting concept that I think is still hard for us, even as open as we are in this community here. I think we lose grip of this idea. I mean, all of us are invested in our 401ks. All of us are invested in the stock market in different ways. All of us are invested in our own futures or in our family's futures. We know what it's like to think about ourselves, to think about our futures. It's really hard to think that what if our real vocation is about others? That's a challenge for us, I think. Communitas, which is the Latin word for community, captures more of the idea of communion. Communion for so many years has been sort of like, for hundreds of years, after the 4th, 5th century, it became sort of this, almost back to the Old Testament, transactional kind of relationship with God. When you took of the bread or you took of the cup, you were sort of participating in this transactional relationship. So now you got God because you kind of kept participating in this ritual. But what Jesus was doing when he did it, it was like, look, this is what I do. I'm broken for people. I'm just vulnerable. I reach out to the unlikely. I cross over to the unwelcome. I find connection with the uncomfortable. Whenever you take this bread or this cup, do it like me. Remember me. That's what I did. That's what we do. That's what that's about. Not a rabbit's foot. Not a magic potion. We all come from different backgrounds, Catholic, Baptist, Pentecostal. We all bring all of those cultural contexts to the moment, and I'm not trying to disabuse you of those, but what I want to encourage you is to try to realize something else was happening at that meal when Jesus was at that Last Supper with his disciples, and it wasn't a magic moment. It was a mysterious moment. Because Jesus was saying, essentially, any act of faith is always going to be a leap of faith. Any act of faith is always going to be a leap of faith. If it's not a leap of faith, it's probably not really about faith. It's probably about comfort, or it's probably about security. But what brings mystery to communion is this willingness to say, this reminds me I'm broken for others. This reminds me it's not about me. It's about everything, about everyone, about something larger than me. And I get to be co-creators in it with the ground of my being. So my uncle used to take me out camping. And we went up into the mountain once, and I'll never forget this. When we went up to the mountain, we were climbing up in Guadalupe Mountains. And I've been there several times. A number of you have probably hiked up in those mountains before. Big Bend is south of there. We got up to the top of the mountain. We camped out for 2 nights. It was freezing cold. Snow was everywhere. We decided we couldn't manage it more than that. My uncle was always one, like maybe you grew up with, one of these people that was always outdoors and always loved the outdoors and always said, you never leave a place worse than you saw it. You always leave it better than when you arrived. Anybody ever hear that phrase from, if you were in Cub Scouts or Girl Scouts, you probably grew up with that too. You always leave a place better than when you came, than when you arrived. And my uncle always practiced that, and so we always practice that as well. And even to this day, if we go camping with my family, we do the same thing. It's just in the back of our head. Always leave a place better than when you arrived. And I try to do that in almost every setting that I find myself. But my uncle would do something else that I thought was strange one time when I saw him. He had taken the little circle of rocks that somebody had made as a makeshift fire pit, and then he had marked on one of them, and he wrote down there, he said, who helped you? No, I'm sorry. He said, who else is here? It's just on a rock. Who else is here? And then he put it back by the fire. And I said, Uncle Mac, did you write that? And he says, yeah, I wrote that. And we was all packing up our backpacks, and we started leaving. I said, are you just going to leave that? He said, yeah. What do you mean, who else is here? We're leaving. And he smiled, and he said, yeah, that's right. And so we start walking back down the hill, and I'm trying to think about, what is he trying to say with this thing? Who else is here? Because I know my uncle loved telling ghost stories. And I'm thinking, somebody's going to see that in the middle of the night when the fire's all lit. Who else is here? And they're going to start to freak out. Like, because you've seen enough movies. And I said, Uncle Mac, what did you mean by that? He's going to freak him out. And he says, do you think we were the first person to walk this trail? And I said, well, no, I guess not. He said, do you think we're the first person to camp in that spot? I said, no. He said, do you think that lots of people have camped in that spot? And I said, yeah. And he said, and yet it looks as though we were one of the first people to come upon it other than the trail. We walk a trail, people have walked before us. We walk a trail, people after us will continue to walk. Who else is here? Right? It's true for our own lives. Who else is here? See, hungry-mongry is that great sort of parable of we just get too caught up in our own selves. It's all about me. Even when we want to be charitable and stuff, it's still kind of about me. But this idea of communion, of communitas, is that it's all about us. And not just us, but there's a mystery to it because it's bigger than us. And so we leap of faith. We have to act, we make an act of faith. We leap and we take this risk of realizing it's about something bigger than me. But even to make that even more risky, we say it's about you. You turn the person, so you turn and look at the other person next to you. Look at people in front of you, around you. Don't be shy. Look at the person next to you. If you want to know why you're here in this room, it's because of them. It's not because of you. I know you came here because you're like, I need some inspiration, and that's fine, but that's not why you're here. You're here because of them. Because if you're not here, then they start losing enthusiasm, just as you would when they're not here. We need one another. We need one another's inspiration. We need one another's participation. We need one another as context for who we are in this life. We're here for each other. And so your presence here is important for the future of 1111, but for the future of that person sitting right next to you. For their week, they just need to know there's some people that are in this mystery together, right? We all need to know that. So we have this chance of participating in this life, not as hungry-mongry, which is kind of the way the world tells us to. Just watch any kind of television program, any kind of advertisement, and they're going to be fun. They'll be fun this afternoon. Watch them this evening. They'll be great fun, but they're all about hungry-mongry, right? I mean, ultimately, that's what they're all about, and we get that. We have to keep that balance. There's stuff we like, but we get to be co-creatives. That's really what communion is about. So when you come up here this morning, and we're going to go right into communion, when you come up here this morning and you partake of these elements, I want to take the magic out of the body and blood of Christ. I want to take the magic out of that. But what I want to put into it is the mystery of what you are called to be in this space, in your spaces wherever you find yourself, in the world outside of this place. What are we called to be as co-creatives? Bringing life to life requires vulnerability, brokenness, requires sustenance, and we provide that for one another. So when you partake of this, if it brings back memories of old traditions and rituals for you, that's fine. But I want to say it is offering life to life, and that each of us is given that opportunity to follow Jesus' example and bring life to life. And when you come forward, we'll serve it, we'll break it off, and don't worry about germs because we're all going to wash our hands first. I'm really self-conscious about that right now. Every one of my grandkids has been sick, and they've all been to my house. So it's a 4-day incubation period. So I'm washing my hands. But as you come to one of the stations, we'll be here, and we'll be back there, and we'll be over here. And as you come, we'll serve you, and just take a piece. We'll hand you a piece of bread. You dunk it into their intinction, and then make your way back to your seat. You can join in with the band singing. But what I want you to remember, for the moment as you take it, make that choose that thought in your mind. How does your life contribute to someone looking down the line and seeing that phrase, who else was here? Because we'll be gone. But what are we doing now that sets the pace for someone else to experience the same kind of joy and completeness?